The webinar, we are excited about the webinar that's going to be presented on today. So happy that you could join us. We are looking forward to having a good day because today is a good day to have a good day. And with us today, our presenter for this webinar on dyslexia, what is it anyway, and what can I do about it? It's being presented by Mr. Jason Tabbert. He is a psychologist, a school psychologist, the Louisiana Center for Dyslexia and Related Learning Disorders at Nicholls State University in Thibodaux, Louisiana. We are blessed and honored to have him join us on today. He has a wealth of information and knowledge on dyslexia. He's done a webinar for us before. He's doing it today, and we plan on having him do more webinars for us in the future on this particular subject matter. So I'm not going to prolong the time. I'm going to be his assistant on today. We also have our executive director, Chanel Jackson, who's joining us, and she will be monitoring our chat box and letting us know when and what things are transpiring technically. And we are going to say this right off. We are going to take questions at the end of the webinar. Jason will take your questions at the end of the webinar. So I suggest that if you have questions as he's going through his presentation, jot those things down so you won't forget them and you'll be able to answer them at the end of the webinar when we have questions and answers. So, Jason, I'm ready to turn this over to you and we can
Okay.
move forward.
Okay. Well, thank you, Miss Esther. I appreciate that introduction. And I feel very blessed and honored to be with you all today to present on this topic, which is near and dear to my heart. And so I've been with the Dyslexia Center here at Nicholls State for almost 24 years, and longer if you include some of the work that I did as a grad student. So it was something that sort of fell in my lap back in the 1990s. I was in my training to become a school psychologist, and I was placed within the center as a graduate student, a graduate assistant to help out with assessments. And so I was here for a few years. Actually, went and worked in Lafourche Parish, excuse me, as a school psychologist, and then I came back full time back in 2002 was yeah, it was mostly 2020, but no, it was a little bit before that. So so without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump in because we have a lot to talk about. So today, what I plan to do with you all, and thank you all for being here, is to define dyslexia in a way that we can kind of all speak in the same terms and language. A part of that will be identifying common characteristics of the learning differences. Hopefully, we'll be able to clarify some misconceptions because there's a lot of chatter and things out there about what dyslexia may be, and some of that is correct. Pardon me. And then some of it may not be. I also want to take a little bit of a turn and talk a little bit about a comorbid condition, specifically ADHD. And so we'll talk about the relationship, between dyslexia and ADHD. And then we'll round that out with some instructional strategies that are both maybe on the academic side and also on the behavioral side. So that's what we'll do in the short time that we have. And so, obviously, a good starting point is how do we define dyslexia? Well, when you look at most definitions and what most researchers write about and how they kind of conceptualize dyslexia as a learning disorder, there are two things that tend to come up as core deficits. And those include problems with word recognition and spelling. So, at its core, individuals who have dyslexia do struggle with those academic tasks. Pardon me, often giving rise to other challenges. So my apologies for my scratchy throat, and so maybe that's an indication that some fall weather is coming. So maybe keep your fingers crossed on that. But in terms of a more formalized definition, of dyslexia, we can look to the National Institute of Health and Human Development and the International Dyslexia Association. So collectively, groups of researchers got together some time ago, specifically in the 90s. And before that time, a definition or a clear definition or agreed upon, let's say, a definition was not available. And people had been talking about what was later known to be dyslexia for well over 100 years. And so a group of researchers convened and came up with what's known as the consensus definition. Apologies again, guys. I'm sorry. And so if we can advance to the next slide, we'll kind of unpack that definition and look at some key factors that define dyslexia. One is that we define dyslexia as a specific learning disorder. Recall that we mentioned a few moments ago that we're ultimately talking about problems with reading and spelling. So it's very specific, to the area of reading and then also with spelling. What they have found over some time, and we can advance to the next part of the slide. So, Ms. Esther, if you want to just kind of keep clicking, for some reason these bullets kind of came out individually, but nevertheless, it's okay to have them all at the same time. What they have found over years and years of research is that these challenges have a neurobiological origin. So, in essence, what that means is that studies have shown, brain imaging studies specifically, have shown that there are some key differences in the brain activities of people who do and don't have dyslexia when they're reading. So think about it as when you don't have dyslexia, there are some key areas of the brain that are active in reading behaviors, whereas when dyslexia is present, other areas tend to be more active. And the key areas that allow for fluent oral language comprehension, fluid comprehension with sound processing, and then ultimately reading. When dyslexia is present, those areas of the brain tend to be underactive. So there's kind of an underactivation in some key areas which are known to influence reading, and then overactivation in some other areas which tend to be more associated with thinking. So the implication is that when an individual does have a reading disorder, he or she is typically trying to think through the words rather than read them with automaticity. So that has been a key finding in research for a number of decades, probably well over 30 years. So specifically, in terms of the manifestation, individuals that have dyslexia are either inaccurate or disfluent with word recognition. Well, what does that really mean? Is that they have trouble identifying and pronouncing unfamiliar words. And so that's either in the way of not being accurate or just not being quick and fluent with being able to do so. And as you can imagine, if that's the case, if you're disfluent with reading words and or decoding words, then that of course will affect you when you're trying to read passages. So again, that core, one of the core deficits is with that word recognition. Um, Other kind of components include deficits in spelling. Of course, we mentioned that. And then I just mentioned the word decoding. And oftentimes, those two skills go hand in hand, even for the better or for the worse, in terms of if an individual can decode words well, then usually he or she can spell well. That's often a correlation. And decoding meaning pronouncing unfamiliar words. Let's say, for the lack of a better term, sounding them out. So typically, when a person can do that well, then that often is associated with good spelling as well. Conversely, if that's a challenge, then it's kind of the inverse relationship in terms of once you have a difficulty in one, it's often associated with the difficulty in the other area. So, in other words, when dyslexia is present, it's often associated with the word recognition issues, the decoding issue, as well as with spelling. These problems typically arise from what's called the phonological component of language. And just think about that as being able to appreciate the fact, cognitively speaking, that our language is made up of sound units called phonemes. So within our language, there are different sounds that can be manipulated. And when you do so, it makes new and different words. So being able to attend to that, and when I say appreciate that, ultimately being able to process that. So a quick example of that would be never seeing the word cat, but just hearing that word. It's made up of different sounds, namely k, a, t. When you put those sounds together, it makes cat. If you were to take away the k sound in the beginning of that word, it would then become at. If you then inserted, let's say, the p sound in front of that word, it would become pat. So that kind of sound manipulation is often um, a deficit or a weakness when dyslexia is present, and that's what is the underlying factor in many cases with having trouble with the decoding and the spelling. So it's kind of like if you don't have that sound awareness, it doesn't make sense to take sounds and try to pair it with letters or groups of letters. Now, these issues are often unexpected. There's a disparity between kind of what you expect and what you get. And so, what I mean by that is that we're talking about an individual, who is smart. We're talking about an individual who's gone to school like everybody else, who's gotten has had access to good teaching, and yet these challenges still exist. And that kind of goes back to that second bullet point, which is that there appears to be some kind of neurobiological um, mechanism that's at play. Now, that's not been fully clear or clarified, yet. And so, even though we know that there are some differences in those the brain processing, researchers haven't yet drilled down, about why exactly that is. So again, it's an unexpected weakness. And so let's see if we can get to another bullet there. I think we have another. Yeah. And so some secondary consequences. So we have the issues with word reading, with pronouncing unfamiliar words. That's likely to affect fluency with reading connected text. Like let's say a passage, a paragraph, reading, kind of like within a book or story, or textbook, or whatever the material may be. And when that's the case, then it makes it quite challenging to understand the material. So in dyslexia, comprehension is a secondary weakness, meaning that it's because of either the inaccuracies and or the disfluency with the reading. And then that often leads to issues with vocabulary and background knowledge. How that works is that when a person doesn't read well and doesn't, often have as much exposure to words in print, then that particular individual is at a disadvantage in developing better reading skills. And that's how um, uh, individuals develop better vocabulary or more expansive vocabulary, and develop background knowledge. And those kind of areas, the vocabulary and background knowledge, when those are kind of lagging behind, then in turn, those lead to a lack or slower progress in reading. So, sort of like if you don't read well, you don't read much. So you don't read well, so you don't read much. So it's kind of kind of one of those situations that kind of plays off of itself and ultimately in not a good way. So, so we talked about dyslexia being at its core problems with word recognition and spelling. And again, those issues giving rise to maybe other challenges. I kind of mentioned the reading fluency and the comprehension on that side. And then with spelling, when an individual is not strong in that area, it will often impact written expression. For example, it's not uncommon for a person who has dyslexia and who ultimately and probably won't spell well, just as a kind of a matter of how things go, when that condition is present, then they tend to stick with words that they know, the safe words, which are often, for the lack of a better term, the little words. And so you may have, let's say an older student who is using words that they really know how to spell, those safe words, but it could lead to written language that is not at the level that you would expect for age and grade. So, kind of those consequences occur, with reading fluency and comprehension on that side, and then spelling and written language on that side of literacy. So that's kind of how dyslexia is defined in a nutshell, kind of what it is. Yep. So we'll go ahead and kind of move forward in our exploration. So back in 2020, there was a legislative act in Baton Rouge at the Capitol that did define dyslexia in a slightly, I don't know, even if you could say slightly, but let's just say in a different way than it was defined nationally. And so, just as an aside, the definition that is currently held by the International Dyslexia Association, there are researchers that are getting together and or expanding that definition currently. So I would say within the next year, maybe more, we'll probably have a different definition again nationally um, for dyslexia that really does bring in some nuances that have been learned over time. So kind of stay tuned on that. But let's maybe talk about what happens here in our home state. So again, back in 2020, through a legislative act, it defined dyslexia as an unexpected difficulty in reading. We touched upon that, kind of an individual who is otherwise intelligent and who has gone to school uh, but has the difficulty in reading most commonly caused by problems in phonological processing. Again, think about that as sound awareness. Think about the at that example, that kind of sound manipulation being a weakness, and it affects the ability to speak, read, and spell. Now, a little aside about speak, that really think about that in terms of pronouncing words and utilization of language. So it's not necessarily a speech problem like some kids may have, like with trouble with actually articulating or, with the physical production of speech. In this regard, they're talking about an unexpected difficulty in reading that affects pronunciation and the usage of language orally. And then, of course, in reading and spelling, as we've been saying. So that's kind of how we're defining it in Louisiana, according to the legislative act, which was then incorporated into our state dyslexia regulations, which are known as Bulletin 1903. And so I'll reference that a little bit later. So Bulletin 1903 are the guidelines in our state that are there to implement dyslexia assessments as well as interventions for kiddos who are, are found to have some oral language based reading and spelling differences. Okay. So yeah, so now as with many things, there's a lot of misconceptions about dyslexia. So it's important that we perhaps not believe everything that we may hear or read. And so let's maybe take a few moments to maybe demystify or clarify some misconceptions about dyslexia. So one of those would include the fact, as a myth or misconception, that if the person doesn't read well and you have dyslexia, then you're probably not smart. Or alternatively, if you're smart, you can't have dyslexia. Well, the fact of the matter, we've touched upon this, is that it's an unexpected difficulty. So we're talking about individuals who are just as smart as peers, maybe even smarter. But because of the way that their brain processes words and sounds for that matter, that they have these problems in in reading and ultimately spelling. So to clarify, essentially, if a person has dyslexia, it means you are smart. And so I think it's important for parents and I think it's important for kids to know that. So whenever a person has dyslexia, it means that your performance in reading, again, and spelling, don't match how smart you are. So that's a myth, hopefully, that we can clear up. So another one would include that if you do well in school, there's no way you can have dyslexia. And so the fact of the matter is that oftentimes we're talking about a student who is smart, hardworking, has the support at home, from moms and dads and brothers and sisters and extended family, and of course teachers and other school personnel and other support systems that help them keep pace. And so just because um, for the lack of a better term, that you're not feeling, that doesn't mean you don't have dyslexia. So that's a common myth that you have to essentially fail in order to have a learning difference, learning disorder. So hopefully, we'll clear that up. And just one more aside on that is that I see that every day because one of the things that we do here in the Dyslexia Center at Nichols is that we provide information, to the public and sort of like kind of teacher trainings and, webinars like we're doing here today, of course. We provide evaluation services, but we also have a college center and we work with well over 100 Nichols students who have dyslexia and related learning disorders. And guess what? They're making it in college. They maintain GPAs. They stay in college. That means their retention rate and their graduation rates are on par with the general university. So that goes back to the fact that, that these people are smart and they can overcome the odds. So I guess that kind of leads us. Let's maybe let's see, Miss Esther, which do we go forward or back? Because I kind of got on a little soapbox there. So let's maybe stick with this one because that kind of segues into this one, which is dyslexia can be outgrown. And the fact of the matter is that it can't. It's a chronic and lifelong, struggle. But what can get better is the individual's ability to cope with it. Their skills can also improve. So perhaps the manifestation gets less, if you will. Still there. What I've learned with our college students is that the two things that tend to stick around include a slow reading rate and trouble with spelling. So it's not something you outgrow, but instead it's something you overcome. So that's kind of what I see kind of on a daily basis. All right. And so what about this? Is that if you have dyslexia, you can't read? Well, no, that's not true. Most individuals who have dyslexia can read. It's just not an automatic skill. So think fluency, think automatic. A term that's often used is automaticity. It's not an automatic process. It's almost like I kind of talked about this a little earlier. It's like individuals are having to think through the words, think through the passages. And so that often leads to just maybe a slowness in being able to read. And that's why it's so important that we provide accommodations. Um, most notably, extended time. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But yeah, most individuals with dyslexia can read. It's just maybe not at the same speed and or level that you would expect for age and grade. Um, and then what about this? That we can't find this problem until the third grade. Well, the fact of the matter is that that's not true. That we know that we can identify factors as early as preschool. Now, that's not to say that we can diagnose a young kid with dyslexia, but we do know some of the earlier language challenges that a young student may have. A family history would also, kind of, be in that category. So we can often tell when kiddos may eventually be diagnosed with dyslexia. Generally speaking, around the middle of first grade is when you get that turning point where kiddos have had enough exposure to education, to teaching, to curricula, to really say that they're behind. And so prior to that, we can definitely identify challenges, and definitely we want to provide the early interventions to try to circumvent, or let's say lessen, those problems. But when those efforts have, not worked as well as we would like, and the student is still struggling in, reading and literacy and spelling and perhaps writing and sometimes even math, for that matter, then around first grade, middle of the year is kind of when that starts to become more evident. But we can do it a lot earlier than previously thought, which a lot of times people would say third grade. So we can do that sooner, and that's important because we want to make sure that students get the help that they need, before things, get, the demand, let's say the demands, change too much. Okay. And so what about this? That we're going to be looking at this one pattern. So that's really not true. Yeah, there are some patterns that are very common, but it's probably best to look at this as a continuum. So think about a range, that we do have some commonalities, but certainly not all students will show the same weaknesses, the same exact level. And so there could be, and are likely to be differences in, how students, show, the presence of dyslexia, and that can be in terms of the specific skills that they struggle with in literacy. The severity level can also be factored in. So it's important to look at this more as a range than just very, very discrete weaknesses. So it's important, that we also consider students who may be more mildly impacted, but still, have need nonetheless. Okay. And so, what about this? That this is a problem with vision. That it's about seeing things backwards, and it has to do with your eyes. Well, that's really not true. You probably, heard me say a few times that sounds, oral language, that's not often. It is where the breakdown is with reading challenges. In fact. The research shows that this is not a visual problem whatsoever. that kids do indeed have problems with their eyes, but that's something else. And so the research shows that when an individual is reading, the eyes just get it into the brain. So the visual processing parts of the brain are only active for milliseconds. And when a person's reading, that is, and those words go into, or the kind of the perception of the words go into the brain and get taken over by language and sounds and those other parts. So it's not really about a problem with seeing, and that's important. That so it's not just about reversing letters or seeing things backwards. That's ultimately a myth and a misconception. What about the fact that this is going to affect more boys than girls? No, what the literature shows is that boys and girls are affected equally. Now, there is some literature out there that, and maybe even some, observations that boys may be more likely to be referred for various reasons related to getting classified as having dyslexia. But in the end, that this is something that occurs across different demographics. And so, is there a silver bullet? What is the recipe? What can I do? Now, there are things, there are ways, there are strategies. We'll get into that in a moment. But we really can't think about this as a silver or a magic bullet that we can't say, oh, if a kiddo has dyslexia, we're going to do this program, or we're going to do these particular techniques, and that's going to going to, be the answer. And so, because of the fact that, of course, all kids are different, and the manifestation's different, we talked about that severity, things of that nature. That it's important ultimately that we screen kids for dyslexia, so we have to find them, and number two, that we provide high quality instruction. And so that can come in different forms, but we have to make sure that the instructional principles are there and that there's no magic program or technique or some other thing that's just going to cure this. So that's important that we manage those expectations. So we kind of talked about the definition and maybe, of course, myths and misconceptions. So let's perhaps dig a little deeper and talk about what really is this? What are we really talking about? So, just by the word dyslexia, we're talking about problems with words, problems reading words, problems maybe pronouncing words, problems spelling words. So dys meaning trouble, lexia meaning words. And here on campus, we do have it's not a part of the university, but on our campus we do have a charter school that is one of several in our state that has a mission to help kiddos who have dyslexia and related learning disorders. But years ago, I came across a sixth grader who said that really dyslexia is when you can't read straight and clean. And I think he was really on to something. And what he was really saying is that when you're not automatic, when you read. And so, that's kind of, in his little quote that you see here, he really also misspelled the word straight in his writing. And so that's why it's in brackets. So it really indicates that the lack of, automaticity with reading and then also the spelling. But, he said it well. It's when it just doesn't happen straight and clean. And so, I think that he really drilled down to the core. Speaking of core, um, most researchers will agree that the heart of the problem is the ability to connect sounds with letters. And we've touched upon that, in several ways, in our short time this morning. And so connecting a sound like, for example, ch, with a representation with letters of that sound, whether it be CH or TCH. So kind of matching those. Some people call that letter sound correspondence, the alphabetic principle. You might even say phonics. And so all of those get to the fact that it's a challenge to match those up in individuals who have dyslexia. So, what does that look like with little kids? These are kiddos who are often late in learning to talk and slow to learn new words. You're likely to see that. Trouble pronouncing speech sounds. These are kiddos who may avoid letters or confuse them. They have trouble recalling letter sounds, and they have trouble breaking words into sounds. Specifically, we call that segmentation, taking a word that is heard and saying the different sounds in the word. So those are some precursors, if you will, in young children who are later perhaps found to have dyslexia. Not in all cases. It's not to say that if you see this, the kid is automatically dyslexic. But when a kid is found to have dyslexia, these are often challenges. And the key point is that when we see these in young kids, we have to try to intervene to make them, the skills that is, better. And then also in kindergarten, but now maybe moving on to first grade, trouble with phonics, connecting letters and sounds, trouble taking words apart. Again, that phonological, the sound awareness. You see the beginnings of poor spelling. You see kiddos who are struggling with common words, what are known as sight words. Those words that that come up time and time again, and that you just have to know by heart. And also, you often see the beginnings of poor handwriting. As kids get a little bit older, you're likely to see, and so this will be on the next slide. You're likely to see trouble with sight words, even with practice, even with with intervention. Um, in grades second and third, still seeing phonics being challenging, connecting letters and sounds. Just as a little bit of an aside, it's not necessarily a specific sign or symptom, but nevertheless, when individuals have dyslexia, they often don't generalize language patterns well. So think about, like, if I know this and I know that, okay, since I know both of those, well, then now I can generalize that and apply that to a new word, a new, kind of, or let's say even just a similar pattern. When dyslexia is present, that's hard, and they don't see the connections. And that's, a lot of times with some of that root, that root cause, or that root, kind of issue, is that you have this weakness that almost prevents the student from kind of generalizing, or not necessarily learning new material, but being able to pick up on the patterns that would allow them to learn faster and ultimately better. And so poor spelling is something that you're likely to see in grades 2 and 3. Now, as kids get a little bit older, then you're seeing problems with reading speed, with comprehension, often, as we said earlier, because of the fact that there's some problems with word recognition. Problems with handwriting may now be manifested in problems with actual expression. So before it's like, okay, maybe the handwriting's immature, it's messy, poor letter formation, the words are not spelled well. Well, now we may be seeing where it's more of an issue with the actual expression of ideas. And these are often students who will avoid reading and writing tasks. Moving along, let's say kind of that upper elementary, almost middle school, these are kids that are slow when they read. They're not accurate. They have trouble again with spelling, with handwriting, written expression. Maybe it's becoming more evident. Why? Because the expectations. They're expected to do more, and so you might see some products that are not to the level that we would want. It's not uncommon for students to avoid, again, if you don't do things well and you probably are feeling self-conscious, then you might kind of push it away and avoid those kinds of tasks. A part of that is that they're weak in reading strategies. And we're often finding those reading comprehension issues, particularly compared to listening comprehension. What that really means is that they can understand when they hear it, let's say a passage or a story, but may have trouble comprehending it when they read it themselves. Now let's kind of move on to, let's say, more, upper middle, let's say more junior high, if you will. Reading is slow. It's kind of laborious. It's not. It's choppy in most cases. Students become overwhelmed. They have trouble coping fast enough. They don't have the strategies that they need for learning and keeping up with the pace. They're needing accommodations and modifications. Well, that has always been the case, even for younger kids, but now the need is even greater, perhaps, and written language is likely to remain a big problem. Moving on to high school, and then you can say on into adulthood, essentially, is that you're looking at individuals who read slowly, who are starting to show declines in comprehension vocabulary. It's not because they're getting worse, it's because everybody else is getting better faster. They're losing the ground, if you will. Everybody else is starting to outpace, them. And then you start to see, the declines in their skill development relative to peers. Writing is very effortful. They're needing strategies for learning and studying. And the question is, are they getting that in high school? Oftentimes kids are faced with, well, you should have known that. You should have learned that already. We don't do that, at this level, and that can be challenging. The need for accommodations and modifications may be greater than ever. They may need a foreign language substitution. Some, schools will allow, and really should allow, perhaps students who are struggling with reading and spelling to take a course such as sign language in lieu of French or Spanish, and still meet the state's criteria for TOPS and later for college admission. So just some food for thought on that. And needing remedial instruction is still present, even though it may not be readily available because of the high school, the demands of high school and the preparation for what happens after high school. So students still need some of that basics, some of the basics. So some related disorders that you may have heard of include dysgraphia, and that would include problems with handwriting and written language, and dyscalculia or dyscalculia. People kind of say it a little bit differently, but essentially that's dyslexia in math. So problems with math facts, math computations, math vocabulary, and math application. When those problems center around math, then that would be a math disorder known as dyscalculia. And so we already said it's not a visual problem, so we can go over that. Um, let's not forget about the strengths. We've been focusing a lot on the problems. And so it's indeed, there are weaknesses. But Sally Shaywitz, who is a researcher and is a co-director for the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, talks about a weakness that's often surrounded by a sea of strengths. So this will be things like creativity, students being intuitive, being persistent, having empathy, being good critical thinkers, things of that nature, strong reasoning skills, oral comprehension. So the flip side of the coin, the reading, the spelling, the writing, the flip side of that coin would be, these strengths. And so we also cannot ignore that in many cases, that individuals who have dyslexia are kind. And so, that's, something that, may not be graded on your report card, but certainly a skill that we would want all students to have. So, that's kind of something we don't want to overlook if a student has kindness, and we want to celebrate that. The next slide is a little, and the reason why it has a date on it is there's a backstory to that. And guys, I'm going to have to pick up the pace because we have still a lot left to cover, and and I don't want to go over time. But anyway, so we have, like, I guess what would be known as a perpetual calendar. It's a little flip book in our office that we have on the counter. And so every day it has like a quote or an idea or something about dyslexia. So my morning routine is to come in and turn on the lights, unlock the door, do that, and then flip it to the next day, and kind of read what they say. And so it was something that was given to us, by a student who has dyslexia. And but anyway, it always has these really, neat, like, either things from research. And one of the day, like in January 28th, for example, it said what makes a child gifted and talented may not always be good grades in school, but a different way of looking at the world and learning. I'm like, that's profound. So I'm often encouraged in the morning when I look at these, I'm going to call them calendar quotes. So that's where that comes from. And I'll share a few more a little bit later on. So just I won't go into too much with this, other than we need to screen kids early. We need to find them. We need to identify areas that need to be targeted in terms of skill development, and we need to monitor progress to make things better. That's an important, and that is included in our state regulations. So that's an important way to help, for the lack of a better term. I was going to say fix. That's probably not, but let's say that we can help minimize these challenges. Okay. And so these researchers point out that the most notable factor that has a positive impact on a risk factor for dyslexia is instruction, meaning that we need to teach kids directly, and we need to make sure that they're supported instructionally. And so we'll kind of talk about that um, in a few moments. In fact, let's see what our next slide. Yeah. So can individuals who have dyslexia learn to read? Well, we've already said that. Yes, with good instruction, proper, intervention, that kiddos can have and can make significant gains, and make really good progress. The problem is that the instruction is often not of the proper intensity or duration. It's not enough, or it stops. And so what happens is those gains that kids often make in early grades, it kind of stagnates, it kind of stops. But it's never too late. So that's important to keep in mind. Okay. And so, just as an aside, I'm not, I probably over prepared for this. This is probably something we could have had a 1 day webinar, and no, here we are trying to do it in an hour. So my apologies for, trying to cram too much in. But our state regulations do speak to the fact that when an individual has characteristics of dyslexia, it is super important that the student be taught in a way that is consistent with research. And that's really what this slide is speaking to, that we need to directly teach these kids given these instructional targets. And then on the next slide, it talks about more of the methodologies, that we need to do this very directly, very systematically, in a very sequential way. So in other words, we need to really hone in on what we do and how we do it. And that's what makes the difference. Okay. So, of course, we know that while kids are improving and responding to the changes in instructional strategies, that they're likely to need accommodations as well as special services. So many of our students who have dyslexia would need accommodations like extended time, perhaps reading their test to them, and possibly eligibility for either a 504 plan or special education. So that's something that we need to make sure kids are support and that our processes, lead to those services when and where appropriate. So I want to just take a few moments to talk about how dyslexia and ADHD kind of intersect. And so they are clear and distinct conditions. However, they are comorbid conditions. There's something called comorbidity, and that really means is that the problems just happen at the same time. You can just have dyslexia, you can just have ADHD, but oftentimes you have both. And so I kind of want to touch upon that and talk about even how the characteristics of attention disorders, there's overlap with characteristics of learning challenges, and there's overlap with just typical learners that don't have these kind of challenges. So on the next one, we had another little calendar quote, which is that dyslexic students often have trouble sequencing. Here's why that's important. It wasn't directly talked about in the slides, but things that happen in order, the alphabet, the days of the week, the months of the year. These things happen in a very particular order or sequence, and that's hard for individuals who have dyslexia. And so that might be a way that you might see a kiddo struggling with an academic task because maybe he forgot what's the order of the days, or gosh, we are in September. What comes next? That might be a challenge. And so on this next slide, what I want to do is let's reframe perhaps what we're seeing with what the student is actually telling us, not verbally, but through actions and maybe what we can do about it. So you may see in classrooms with teachers and other school personnel or at home a kiddo who looks disinterested. They don't seem motivated. They're off task. They're either agitated or maybe aggressive. They refuse to do work. They seem forgetful. They're disorganized, or you know what? They just have I don't care attitude. What the student may actually be telling us through those behaviors is that I can't think clearly. I'm lost. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. I'm frustrated. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do next. I know you told me, but I keep forgetting. I can't find it. I don't know where it is. I don't understand what you're asking me to do. Now, we can't expect a kid to say these things because A, they're not probably at a level of development that they could, verbalize these things or even have an awareness. So we have to read between the lines and say, okay, you look this way, but this is what your behavior is telling me. Um, or you know what? I'm scared. I'm nervous. So things would be giving them cues and prompts, redirecting them, reteaching them, repeating instructions, modeling. I'm going to do it first. Then we're going to do it together before I can expect you to do it. So I do, we do, you do. Giving them a calm down period, giving them more practice, perhaps supplementing oral instructions with written instructions. Uh, Help to create an organization system and giving them guided notes, when they're having to write things down. So again, let's consider what maybe would be considered ultimately a negative behavior, or like what people might consider to be like an unmotivated student. It's probably not that. It's probably something else, and we've kind of talked about that. And so that's kind of on the learning challenge side. So let's maybe get to the one on, let's maybe kind of go over to the one, like a few more slides, this one. And so when ADHD is present, and we know it often is when dyslexia is at play, these are kids that look disinterested. They're forgetful many times. They can't follow multi-step instructions. They interrupt. They fall behind. They lack initiative. They don't provide the effort that we would want from them. They focus on the small details and don't see the bigger picture. They're hyperactive, perhaps, and there's variability in their work product and quality, meaning like they do well one time, but then not the other. And that's true of kids with dyslexia. What this may be telling us is that I can't concentrate. I keep getting distracted. I can't remember what I need to remember. It's too much. I'm overwhelmed. Um, I just had to tell you something quickly. I had to get it out. That impulsivity. Um, I didn't realize it was taking so long. I was so focused on other things or distracted. I didn't realize I was not completing my work. Um, I don't know where to start. What did I do wrong? I don't understand why, what it is that I didn't do the way I was supposed to. Um, there's just too much going on. I can't sit still. I don't know why this is harder today than it was yesterday. And I don't like asking for help, or I don't know how to ask for help. So some of those behaviors might actually be a way for the student to tell us these things, and the way that we can support them um, is to help them overcome their focus, their memory, their information processing, being overstimulated, because that's ultimately what it's showing us. Not that they don't want to try, but maybe they don't know how. And so we'll move forward and kind of come to some other things that will help. So we also have to consider outside effort. This is often why students don't get identified, because they're doing okay, because they're getting a lot of support, and that might be the way that they're kind of keeping enough pace. So we don't want to overlook kiddos, and we have to consider the outside efforts that are occurring when we're trying to identify issues. And that's oftentimes what's happening at home, you know, that they're getting support beyond what you would expect a person of that age or grade to need. Um, I thought this was an interesting one. Expecting all kids the same age to learn from the same materials is like expecting kids the same age to wear the same size clothes. It's like, no, we would never expect that. So when I read this back in the summertime, I was like, wow, yep, yep, you know, Madeline Hunter, you said it well. And so, yeah, so we're kind of getting towards, we kind of talked about this in the dyslexia stuff. We have to make sure, though, that our classroom practices are supporting those issues, whether it be on the learning side of things or on the attention side of things. And I want to yeah, some days are good, some days are not, and there's no apparent reason. So we have to not misperceive that as a lack of effort. That the inconsistencies in student performance is something we're likely to expect, or we should expect, in fact. This is an interesting one. When researchers have looked at, let's say, typical learners, when they succeed, they say, I did it. It's my effort. When they fail, they say, I need to do something more. I need to try harder. When they've studied kiddos with dyslexia, when they succeed, they may attribute it to luck. Well, it just happened. And if they fail, they internalize it and say it's because I'm not as smart. So that's something we really need to really support kiddos on the emotional side and the self confidence side of things. And so let's maybe fast forward if you don't mind, Miss Esther. I'm gonna just keep flipping until I say, okay. So interventions. So let's maybe just talk real briefly about interventions, both on the behavior side of things and on the academic side. So on the behavior side of things, it's important that in the classroom setting, we implement strategies and let's say interventions that modify the environmental conditions to make learning, to make it more conducive for learning. So things like the good behavior game, a daily behavior report card, or there's an intervention called check in, check out. So not to go into it too much, good behavior game is split the class in two and the kids compete against one another. If a student from one team, if you will, kind of doesn't follow a rule, they get like let's say a tick mark. And then the ones that have, let's say the least amount of, you know, let's say rule violations, they are reinforced. And that can be a way to get some competition and it can get a way for kiddos to kind of self-reflect, if you will, and monitor their behavior. A daily behavior report card would be where I'm going to identify some targets that are maybe issues, and when you reach a predetermined level of performance, then I'm going to reinforce that with some kind of, something like extra time or maybe an actual reinforcer, like it could be tangible, it could possibly be edible. Not always, but it's a way to help kiddos change behaviors that interfere with learning. Check in and check out would be a trusted adult would monitor, would actually check in with kids and would review positive behavior expectations. And then at the end of the day, or it wouldn't have to be at the end of the day, it could be even after a class period, would check in again with the kid and say, okay, how do we do? What do we do well? What do we do, not so well that we need to improve upon? So I think at this point, these slides just kind of show the good behavior game and kind of different teams to try to get kids to engage in the behaviors that support learning, active task engagement, participation, work completion, things of that nature. So we can kind of this is like an example of a daily behavior report card that's more individualized. So the other one would be more class-wide. This would be more individual, as would check-in and check-out. Would most likely be an individual intervention. Okay. It's important that we acknowledge that we need to teach kids not only academic tasks, but we need to teach them time management, study skills, prioritizing, social skills, things of that nature that we can't assume that they know how. Just like we wouldn't expect a kiddo to learn reading by themselves or to learn math by themselves, that we have to teach them non-academic behaviors, but behaviors that support learning. All right. So I think we're probably at a relatively good stopping point, even though we did have a few more slides related to the interventions. And so, yeah, I wish, and, maybe for the future we will have something that's a little bit more extended. But I know that a lot of you are just kind of joining us, kind of maybe on a lunch hour or just between obligations. So, I know that we're, a little bit beyond our hour. So, certainly it would be understandable if someone had to jump off. But I wanted to maybe open it up to some questions, about something that we've spoken about, and so that we can have some time for that.
Okay, we're going to ask our Chanel if she would look and see if there were any things in the chat box that anybody put in, or if they're ready at this time to put their questions in the chat box, or however she chooses to do that.
Okay, so we do have quite a few questions and comments in the chat box. So the first thing was the IDA dyslexia definition has recently been updated as of last month. Okay, and then the next one was could a precursor also be trouble with nonsense words? Since the landscape is changing for dyslexia and some definitions attribute it to neurobiological origins, do you see a change with insurance covering diagnostic testing? Parents can know and be limited by resources and coverage.
Yes, that's true. So let's maybe back up that there are some changes in special education that the way that Louisiana, so under the federal IDEA, that filters down into our state under what's called Bulletin 1508, and that's how we define different categories of disabilities, including learning differences. So there is um, sort of the change insofar as what was previously would still be known as specific learning disabilities, including those related to reading. It will also include dyslexia. So there'll be some change. It may not or really won't change necessarily how we go about it, but there would be a different, maybe more descriptive way to define a learning difference for kids who qualify for IEPs. So that's kind of on the horizon, most likely to take effect next calendar year, from what I'm understanding. Nonsense words, yes. So many times kiddos who have dyslexia struggle with the nonsense words because what those do is it drills down, can you generalize those language in those phonics patterns? We not only need to look at is it accuracy, but also is it fluency? Is it automaticity? Some kids, though, they do okay at the word level, but it's when you put it with at the passage level. So it's again, let's think about the continuum. But nonsense, struggle with nonsense is often something you would see, but not necessarily in all cases. I think the next, sort of question was about insurance coverage for diagnostics. That's an insurance. My experience is that that's related to different, of course, insurance policies, different, subject to different parameters within one's own coverage. And my experience has been, and I don't know if I'm overgeneralizing, but oftentimes when a student only has a learning disability, that might not be something that's covered through insurance. But again, I mean, don't, that's again maybe my experiences and kind of maybe some of the individuals with whom I've worked. But that is it's a challenge. It's how we can make sure families, students, of course, get access to proper identification, and that's why it's important that we advocate at the state level to make sure that our screening procedures, our assessment procedures, and regulations match what are best practices based on the literature. And so, yeah, because it is an obligation for schools and districts to find children who are showing these patterns, to identify them properly so that the student can in turn get the proper support through instructional interventions and remediation, as well as potential accommodations. Absolutely.
Okay,
And
great. I think
you
this
know,
is more of a statement versus a question. It said we love sign language, but we didn't anticipate it. We didn't appreciate that it was web-based course. It created some issues the same as foreign languages would, i.e., needing to be kept up with closed captioning.
Yeah, and so the unfortunate thing with that substitution, foreign language substitution, is that, as you can imagine, it would be, a challenge for a school to have someone who would have the expertise to be able, to teach students sign language. So my experience, and even this was true with my own son, who took sign language in high school. It was like a web-based course. Yes.
And this is just basically a comment about the slides. Will they be able to get the slides? We will email the slideshow out if that's okay with Jason.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Please
and
do.
then also it will be on our YouTube channel. So when you get a copy of the slide deck, you will also get a link to this webinar that will be placed on our YouTube channel. And we have another comment. This has been fantastic. I've loved to attend an extended version of this, especially with the change in landscape. Dyslexia diagnostics are generally regarding as educational testing, it seems.
Mhm. Yeah, and so, I think that's something that we need to work towards, is making sure that we're blending, obviously, the educational side of things, because that's where probably most students are identified, but making sure that we're taking in the information that we're learning through science, which may come out of maybe even, often the medical community, and making sure we're blending, those things together, because in the end, that's how we can provide the best support to students when we do something that is, of course, empirically based.
All right, and I don't see any more questions in the chat, Jason.
Okay. Well, thank you all for having me, and to the participants that unfortunately do not get to see. So I'm assuming that you guys are out there. So I'm just seeing Miss Chanel and Miss Esther. But thank you for being, here today. Thank you for your commitment to helping either your own family member, your child, or your students, or the students with whom you work. I appreciate that. And so we're gonna, keep plowing through, and continue to make differences, and for students, and get them to reach their potential. So I thank you for having me, and I appreciate you being here.
I'd just like to say real quickly, Jason, again, thank you. We are grateful to have you here. But since they're saying that they would like to see an extended version, maybe Chanel and I'll be talking futuristically and then get with Jason and see if we can get him to come maybe to Bossier and do maybe a 1 day, maybe from like 9 to 2 or something, workshop that people can come in person. So,
Yep.
and get a more extended version of it.
Yeah, and so while there is a little bit of a distance between us, there's Highway 90 and I-49 to get there. So yeah, and so I would definitely be open to that. So
Okay.
we'll definitely consider that, because I know that the web base gives us access, but there's something about being in person.
In
So we
person, exactly. I agree with you totally.
definitely open to that. So for sure, let's keep that in our conversation.
All right. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you later.